This is a special episode of CRM Audio, the Microsoft Business Applications podcast focused on Dynamics performance with Stephan Smith. This episode is brought to you by KingswaySoft. KingswaySoft is a leading integration provider offering software solutions that make data integrations affordable and painlessly easy. Thousands of enterprise clients from over 80 countries and regions rely on KingswaySoft to integrate data with various business systems in order to drive their business efficiency and fully leverage their information assets. KingswaySoft is a leading provider of Microsoft Dynamics integration software, including Dynamics 365, CRM, AX, NAV, GPSL, as well as many other applications. We thank KingswaySoft for sponsoring CRM Audio, the Microsoft Business Applications podcast. This is Joel Lindstrom, and I'm here with somebody new to the CRM Audio Network, Stephan Smith. Now, Stephan's not new to the Dynamics community. You may have seen him on social media or other places. So, Stephan, give us a little bit about your background.
I started off as a regular .NET developer, and there came a point in my career where I wanted to do something that would make me stand out. As it stands, there's a lot of .NET developers, quote unquote, out there that, are developers, but at the same time, they're not special, so to speak. So in my journey, I decided that I needed a niche focus area that I could be, very good at that one particular thing. And then I could kind of segment myself away from the rest of the crowd. So that ended up being Dynamics. So back in 2010, at the tail end of CRM 4.0, I had joined a company that was working on an ISV project to integrate Dynamics with a group of ERP systems.
Okay.
And from there, I decided that I didn't want to sit behind a desk anymore in the dark. Like I literally had a desk in the dark with no windows.
No windows.
But I did have a refrigerator with Hot Pockets and soda.
What else do you need?
Well, just soda, water. Well, Red Bull, of course. That always helps too. But after that little stint, that company actually decided to switch to Salesforce instead of Dynamics, and they wanted us to all learn Salesforce. And I told them, I said, "Hey guys, thanks, but no thanks. I'm a Microsoft guy, so I'm going to keep going with that." So I left and went back into the consulting realm, which I was in before. And kind of the rest is history, other than the fact that I joined up with Microsoft back in 2012, where I had a pretty good run there and learned a great deal of things, including one of my favorite topics is system performance and integration.
Yeah, so you're Mr. Performance, and that's kind of the theme of what we're going to be talking about.
I guess that is my thing now. Yes.
And you're now working with Hitachi Solutions, so you're right next door to me. So I said, "Hey, come on the podcast."
Yes, we're neighbors now, so that's great.
So you also are fairly well known. LinkedIn, social media. You've got a lot of connections. Did you connect with everybody at Microsoft? What did you do?
So I started off pretty slow, like most people. I was a member of LinkedIn, but I didn't really have a strategy at any point. So I would connect with people, and I would see, posts and things like that, but I wasn't really as active, especially being at Microsoft. I was pretty heads down on projects, so let's just say I wasn't being very social at the time. But I do a lot of reading, and I'd come across a few books that reference some more social strategies to use to kind of elevate your visibility, but also kind of help you in your career. So at that point, I started to reach out to other people in the Dynamics community to basically either connect to them or get to where I could see their feeds. So whenever I open up LinkedIn, I just have this buffet of commentary and posts on Dynamics that when you read it throughout the day, it adds quite a bit of value to me from a knowledge standpoint.
The first time, whenever I log into LinkedIn, I always see Ben Ballmer. First thing, Ben Ballmer.
Yes, Ben is pretty prolific. He's always out there, and he's pretty sociable.
So speak to the debate between posts and articles. I hear some people say, I posted an article, it got 100 views. I posted a I put a post. It got 5,000 views. What's
Right.
better? How are they different? How do you approach them?
I use posts as a mechanism to just kind of say something that I don't necessarily need it to stick around for any period of time. Maybe
it's kind of like a perishable banana at the
exactly.
grocery store.
It's a banana as opposed to a car. Maybe, I don't know. But from a profile perspective, I think the articles definitely can add value and definitely help your personal brand. And you do want those to stick around, obviously, because that's actually part of how people find your profile.
Right.
And LinkedIn, as any other social network, will value native content as opposed to like a blog that you post outside in WordPress and then just post a link. That's not going to be as discoverable as an actual article.
So when you write a blog post, do you also post it as a LinkedIn article?
I do. More often than not. It depends on what the post is about. Like, because sometimes I post on stuff that's not specifically dynamics or something that I necessarily want to add it to my profile. But for the large part, if it's a deep article or an article that I think is relevant to that audience, I'll go ahead and post it as a separate LinkedIn article as well, with a link back to the actual blog.
Okay. So we can't talk about this without talking about the elephant in the room, which is the LinkedIn post that you are best known for.
Yes.
And
yes.
Can you, to this post, if I remember right, it said, "I don't code." Basically, nobody should say that, right?
Well,
what was the way you said it?
If I remember correctly, it said something to the effect that the thing that I never want to hear on a project is I don't code. And as you know, that one simple statement, as innocent as it was, kind of turned into a massive.
You had like hundreds
elephant.
Of comments on that thing.
It
got
went
a Neil Benson post out of it.
yes, Neil definitely had some things to say about it.
And we've talked about it, and I don't think you were saying that consultants should write code.
Right. Actually, the backstory, and sometimes you say something, but the meaning doesn't carry through. But that was a little brief post. I was walking down the street one day, and I was irritated at something, and I said, you know what? I don't like when people say this, because I keep hearing it, right? So the reason I hear it, well, let's get into the backstory. So the backstory of it is, that is a comment that, in my experience, has been made a number of times by a particular person on a team who is already, let's say, slacking off. And they're not doing things that we need to get done in order to meet like a deadline or something like that. And so what I've found is that the people that say this typically are we'll just call them slackers.
So
right?
It's an excuse.
It's
or
an
a
excuse.
Exactly. I'm not going to touch that.
Yeah, and I don't know why that specific statement kind of stood out to me, but the notion is that basically my role is X, and we don't have any necessarily work in that X role at the moment, and I don't want to do anything else. So what happened, of course, is when I posted that, the army of functional consultants came out and slayed me mercilessly. And I definitely can understand the sentiment, but of course the leader of the charge was Neil.
Right. Well, and I think the thing is that some of the developer types saw it too and kind of recoiled, thinking, "Oh, he wants the citizen developers to write JavaScript or plugins," and we don't want that to happen.
No, we don't. But another thing that was part of that post that was lost in the threads, because I actually did post some stuff in the threads, but the threads were moving so fast I don't think anybody ever saw it, was the fact that I've worked on several cross-functional teams where you have, let's say you have a functional consultant that maybe isn't a developer, but they can read code and they can kind of get in the weeds. Same thing with a developer that's, their core is development, but they're able to kind of maneuver around the functional aspects. I've found that those kind of teams work very well, and the synergy there is pretty high. Mm-hmm. And I've had a lot of success with those kinds of teams, right, where we had more of those cross-functional members. So that was kind of part of it. But what I wasn't saying was that if you're a BA, you should be reading JavaScript and C# books and learning Visual Studio.
But if you are a functional consultant or architect, you should be comfortable gathering requirements and designing the way that the spec should work to hand it to a developer who can then develop it. I would go with the flip side. Sometimes developers use "I don't do business process" as a crutch. Yes. They don't want to get in the meeting and talk about how the why behind it. They just want to write the code, and that's a bad mix too. Because if you limit yourself and say "I don't do anything towards X," you're going to limit your career options.
Oh, definitely. And I've also seen in the past where some people that say I don't do, like, just flat out say I don't do code at all. That's not, I'm not even interested in it. I've seen a few layoffs where, unfortunately, the fact is that developers are quote unquote seen as more valuable, especially in the consulting realm, than the functional, even though I don't really agree with that. But when it comes down to layoffs, I've seen more often than not the functional people are the first to get the axe.
The ones with the most limited skills.
Yeah, exactly. Because if you can't send them, say, for example, on a solo gig, or a gig where you don't necessarily have all the development skill sets, like maybe like a pre-sales thing or something like that, it can be a crutch or a hindrance that management sees as a downside. But as I said, Neil definitely took the charge. He even wrote a blog or a LinkedIn article on it, which I totally understand his position.
But I don't think you disagree with Neil's point.
I don't actually disagree with Neil, actually.
So exclusive headline is Stephan Smith said that consultants should not write code.
Right. Yes. So I actually do agree with Neil's position. I think, like we said, it was just a little slight misunderstanding in my quick 2-second blip out into the social atmosphere. But
so in your career working at Microsoft and other places, you've worked with some really, really big environments.
I did.
What's the biggest Dynamics environment? You haven't mentioned company name or whatever, but just how many total users, how many geographies are involved?
So the actual largest implementation that I worked on had that was actually live was 20,000.
Okay.
I also worked on one that it was targeting 50,000.
And I think probably if you were to take the average size Dynamics deployment, it's probably 200 to 500 users.
Well, at MCS, we only really work with the enterprise class customers. So I would say probably on average, the user size would be anywhere from 2,000 to 10,000.
But I'm saying if you take the world, the audience of all Dynamics deployments, there's a lot of small ones, there's some medium-sized ones, and there's a few really big ones.
Right.
And so you were working with the whales, but the average customer, the average company using Dynamics is quite a bit smaller, at 10% of that user base. So what are the challenges from a performance perspective for a 20 to 30,000 user deployment that a 300 user deployment doesn't see?
The two things that I've always noticed that became problems, usually not in development, but then during production, is what I like to call business process concurrency violations and integrations that cause other issues within the system.
Okay.
When you're dealing with a large number of users, there's two things. You have user concurrency and you have business automation concurrency. So as the users are in the system, they're updating records, they're creating records. Those records are obviously usually causing business processes to execute. Mm-hmm. And depending on the design of those business processes, they will cause some challenges within the database. So, for example, there's one pattern that I call the common ancestor update pattern, where let's say you have a contact and you have a phone call or a list of activities, and let's say, for example, you want to update a last activity date on the contact. What would usually happen is a developer will go in and just write a plugin on every activity that will try to update a date field, let's say, on the contact. The challenge with that is, while that can usually work in smaller systems, when you're in a very large environment, especially if you have like any kind of mass update of activities, what it does is it fires off a bunch of workflows or plugins that all try to update the same exact record at the same time.
Yeah, I always shudder when I hear a requirement. I want this workflow to run every time an appointment gets created.
Right, yes.
Just because activities, the fact you've got all the activity entities sharing that same base table is...
Yes, that's the
and
other...
you have people creating in bulk activities, tracking activities in bulk,
Right.
You know, campaigns creating activities, a lot of different things where it's just a lot of traffic. I can imagine that can cause a lot of problems.
Yeah, so I think the thing to always consider when designing a system is the fact that it's running on a SQL database, right? So you have to consider the real ramifications of how business processes are being executed in a relational database format. So record locking is a real thing. It's valuable, but it also is something that when a development team is building the automation for a system, they're not typically thinking of what impact their code's going to have on maybe some other parts of the system. And that's where...
So with that common ancestor problem for your very large deployments, did it show up initially, or is it the kind of thing that as they grew and scaled out, something that worked fine with, a smaller number of users, issues started happening?
So when you have a very small user base, you have much less activity in regards to those activities being updated necessarily on the same record. Mm-hmm. But when you get into a lot of larger scale deployments and especially like team selling scenarios where you have multiple people interacting with customers at the same time, that's when you start to see those kinds of issues popping up.
Okay.
So when the thing that's kind of insidious about it is the fact that you can do your testing, your dev testing, and your user testing and UAT. You typically don't tend to see those things becoming a problem until you actually go live, which is obviously a little late at that point.
So when you have that scenario, like you have the issue caused with the last update date or the last activity date with the common ancestor problem, is it, if that's running on an asynchronous workflow or a plugin, and sometimes those issues happen after the user has moved on,
right?
Like, how did that become apparent? Did people suddenly start noticing a lot of errors in the event log, or did they start seeing that field's not being updated correctly?
Yeah, both actually. You'll start to see errors in the event log for workflows not. And this
is on premises, of course.
Well, that's the same thing for the cloud as well.
You just don't see the event log.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, right. Yeah, but you would see, for example, that the like a workflow or plugin failing.
Okay.
But the thing that's harder, online, of course, is not being able to have access to the physical database. But of course, with the new org insights, that's going to be a lot easier to do, even in an online scenario. Mm-hmm. But the biggest challenge is the locking that occurs. It doesn't just impact that particular record. It can actually start impacting the system performance as a whole, especially when it happens at a mass scale.
So you figured out, okay, we have this problem due to concurrent issues.
Right.
We found this issue, the workflow of the plugin's failing. What do you do? A, talk the users out of what they're doing.
Yeah, right.
B, come up with a different way to do it.
So it's really just a matter of design style. So for example, the way to properly do something of that nature is to use a polling process instead of, basically, when you have a plugin that fires on all the different activities, that's basically called a competitive consumer pattern, and that's how you would consume a queue, for example, for work. But a queue is designed to give you one record per process at a time, whereas a table, the database is going to use locking to make sure that two processes can't update the same exact record at the same time. So you'd use a polling process where a single threaded process, say, for example, would go through the records and say, okay, here are the records that need to be updated, and it would update those records as a single threaded process, as opposed to all the different workflows firing at the same time on different threads attempting to update the same record.
Right. And that's where it might be something you develop, or you could even use KingswaySoft or some such tool to do a batch job. And realistically, that type of field doesn't need to be updated real time.
Exactly. Too.
If it's updated once a day, that's typically okay. But you're right. If 10 people are doing an activity against the same person or the same company, that's a lot of updates, versus if you just get the max update date and update it every night, that can be fine.
And you could even run it every hour. I mean, it's as long as it's not something that's executing every single minute.
Right.
That could be potentially impacting the during operating hours what the users are doing.
Right.
That's fine as well.
So how do you balance performance with growth? So we know that, okay, if you get to 20,000 users and team selling with 20 people working on the same opportunity, you might have this issue. But right now we're at 500 users and 2 users that don't really touch each other. The contention is that more performance solution for the bigger environment costs more development time to put in, whereas the quick workflow is the easy, quick way that we can get it in. And it's hard to justify sometimes, building it that way from the beginning. Do you have to go through that pain to get it, or do you push for the more enterprise grade solution up front?
Yeah, you're right. Obviously, there's a cost to trying to build for enterprise style deployments up front. If you're starting off and you're only dealing with, say even a couple hundred or a couple thousand users, you could decide to go with a more simpler approach that's more kind of focused on speed of development as opposed to scalability. But scalability itself is really, it's an ongoing process. It never ends. Even after deployment, you basically have to watch your system to see what symptoms it's experiencing and then address those as you go. So for example, maybe you do go with the plugin or the workflow that fires on every update of an activity, that updates a contact at first, but the moment you start seeing the errors in the logs that workflows are not completing or plugins are not executing successfully, you can take a deeper look and say, okay, perhaps we need to make a design change here, and kind of keep moving forward with that.
Yeah, I like that. Continually evaluate it. I recommend people do kind of a reevaluation either each time they see a new group of users coming out of the system to see what the performance impacts will be, or when they introduce a new business process or a new phase, because something that works fine, kind of like the single level ranch house, once you add that second story to it, it's a different story.
I think the biggest challenge though is the tech lead is really, in my opinion, in charge of the performance aspects of a system, both architecturally and being able to see, as the different development cycles are happening, the features that are being built, how those different features could possibly come in contention with each other when they go to production. So it's, when you give a developer a new feature to work on, he's typically not going to care what someone else is working on. He's focused on completing his feature for that sprint, let's say. But it's when the tech lead comes in and looks at the big picture. He's the one, or she's the one, could say, hey, guys, I see that this and this was built this way, but it looks like these two things could possibly conflict with each other.
Right.
So that's kind of the way that I've always approached projects as a tech lead, is I'm overseeing the architecture, but also the possible performance issues that could arise from the design that we're using.
Yeah, and I think people somewhat have the mindset now, it's in the cloud, I don't need to worry about that stuff.
It's even more in the cloud.
Yeah, and what you don't realize is Microsoft is throttling, your database and your application. They're not giving you free reign. So if you want to import 1 million records in 2 hours, you're going to have problems. Or if you have a very busy integration and a lot of workflows and user processes, you can still see performance issues, even though you have the kind of unlimited cloud at your disposal. Right. You're still not unlimited there. So that's why your point about testing not being equivalent to production load is dead on, and you need to take that into account and plan for some performance tweaking and working with Microsoft if you find some performance issues after go live, once you have the bigger user audience come onto the system.
And as far as the cloud, Microsoft doesn't really like when you do performance testing in your online tenant, because you are potentially impacting other users in that same tenant as well. So, but the approach that I try to take when it comes to performance is to make sure that we design it in such a way that I can expect a certain level of performance up front, as opposed to kind of waiting until an issue happens and everybody's running around with their hair on fire. But it is kind of challenging from a performance standpoint when you're in the cloud. And a case in point is I actually had one project where we took down the async service for the entire tenant because somebody decided to import 1 million leads, and we had basically 5 or 6 different async workflows that were firing. And actually, he did it 4 times. So,
did you get a call from somebody
at
the data center?
I actually got a physical call from the CRM Online Operations Center, and the guy basically said, "What are you doing over there? Because you just brought down the entire async service." And I apologized, but it wasn't my fault. But well, that just goes to show, for example, we had 5 or 6 async workflows on the lead, but in this sales scenario, and actually that was for the 50,000 user deployment. If you had a bunch of users importing leads at the same time, that's a valid scenario that you have to kind of take into account. So
yeah, for sure. That's one reason to use KingswaySoft or a tool like that can disable workflows when you do imports. So this is great. I think this is a topic that we haven't talked about that much because most of us are not at the level of performance experience that you have. So love to have you come back and talk some more, maybe about performance difference between synchronous and asynchronous workflows and some of those other topics.
Sure.
And if listeners have any questions about performance that you'd like us to talk about, just send them our way to
voice@crm.audio.
But thanks, Stephen, for coming on here, and thanks for sharing your performance and clarifying that consultants should not write code.
This has been CRM Audio, the Dynamics 365 podcast. Send us your feedback at voice@crm.audio. Check out our other shows at crm.audio or subscribe on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Stitcher, TuneIn, and any place else podcasts are offered. This podcast is a production of Dynamics Podcast, LLC.